You see a constant churning and changing of the journalistic media's landscape, in which the 24-hour news channel becomes an extended arm of the state and large corporate houses. I think at least a good 20 years before Modi comes to power, you really see them occupying every aspect of life and kind of revising and rewriting history, telling an Hindu majority population that they are the victims.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. The supplication of big media companies to Donald Trump's 2.0 agenda arguably began before he even won re-election, when Jeff Bezos blocked the Washington Post from endorsing Kamala Harris. In July, Paramount Global, which owns CBS News, paid Trump $16 million to settle a lawsuit over the editing of a 60-minute interview with Ms. Harris. Then in August, media conglomerate Skydance purchased Paramount for $8 billion. As part of the deal, Paramount had to hire an ombudsman to oversee CBS News and monitor for bias. Their choice was Kenneth Weinstein, a former Trump advisor. I could go on. This week's show is a rerun, but it feels even more timely now than when we first published it in November 2023. When we first read Suchitra Vijayan's reporting on the media in India, we were shocked to learn that much of the press in the world's largest democracy had fallen in line with Narendra Modi's authoritarian agenda. Now, the interview feels like a portent of what could happen in the United States. In India today, 75% or more of news organizations are now owned by 4 or 5 large corporations, all led by allies of Modi. In contrast, journalists who've dared criticize the government have been harassed, detained, imprisoned, and even murdered. Suchitra Vijayan is a journalist and attorney originally from Madras in South India. Her latest book, How Long Can the Moon Be Caged?, tells the story of political prisoners in India today, including artists, activists, academics, and, of course, journalists. She's also the founder of the Polis Project, a hybrid journalism and research organization. Suchitra lives in New York City, and you'll hear some passing sirens in the background during the interview. There's a phrase Suchitra likes to use to describe Indian culture and society, the cosmopolitanism of small places. I started by asking her to explain what that means.
What the phrase really means to me is what Indian society used to be, which really is the peaceful coexistence of many. And this coexistence was not something that happened because of engineering. It was something that was absolutely important for a society to just exist at a very bare minimum level. A place where people existed in a way that they helped each other, they were thoughtful, they were considerate. While this is a deeply religious and a society with caste hierarchies, people still tried their best. And I think that, of course, is increasingly eroded in the last few years.
Narendra Modi, now India's Prime Minister, was Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat from 2001 to 2014. Modi has been called out inside and outside of India for his complicity in the anti-Muslim riots there in 2002. He's also been praised for the state's economic growth during his tenure. What was Modi's tenure in Gujarat like, and how did it differ from previous governorships?
I think one thing that people often forget is that the first time Modi comes to power, he's not elected. He's replacing an existing chief minister of Gujarat. And after he becomes the chief minister, when he's not elected the first time, the Gujarat pogrom happens. So to kind of set this in context, Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat from 2001 to 2014. During his tenure, the state really becomes a laboratory for Hindutva experiment, which is exclusionary, which is autocratic, ethno-nationalistic. He's really trying out many of his ideas that he then goes on to implement as a prime minister in Gujarat. So under his leadership, what you really saw was an unprecedented targeting of the Muslims. I want to be very clear that Muslims and other minority and oppressed communities in India, whether they're Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasis, have always faced state violence. So what Modi is doing is not new, but the nature, the extent, the force kind of becomes more brutal, more violent. So under Modi, the Muslim population in Gujarat really see a kind of brutal, indiscriminate state violence, extrajudicial killing, targeted killings, political assassinations following the pogrom. Yet in all of these cases, Modi is given a clean sheet by the Supreme Court of India. So despite being numerous prosecutable evidence, the courts actually say that there is no prosecutable evidence, which is very important because this is something that will become a mainstay in so much of the prosecutions against Modi and BJP and many other right-wing political leaders. And another thing to really also understand is that Modi is gone after almost everybody who resisted him during the Gujarat pogroms. Most of them are either jailed or they're dead. Another thing that you rightly pointed out is that everybody hyped Modi as presiding over growth and development. It was called the Gujarat model. But what the Gujarat model was in reality was a very much an aggressive implementation of growth and development on behalf of large private investors. So the Gujarat model in reality was working for the rich against the poor. It was an explosive mix of policies and actions, violent Hindu nationalism, crony capitalism. And before becoming prime minister, Modi, during his electoral campaign, really projected himself as this muscular nationalist, as the single, powerful, strong man. He used hate speeches in all of these rallies, and then he wins this landslide election in 2014. And of course, once he becomes a prime minister, you see everything experimented with in Gujarat between 2001 and 2014 then becomes a nationwide exercise in absolute brutality and violence.
You know, in 2014, the BJP, a Hindu nationalist party, as you pointed out, won the election by a landslide. What do you think accounts for this shift to the authoritarian right?
I think we have to acknowledge the fact that so much of this fascism and so much of this right-wing tendencies have always existed in India. For example, Professor Gyan Prakash, writing about his book on emergency that happened during Indira Gandhi's regime, India's first declared emergency, makes a point that this deeply fascist ideology, authoritarian tendencies are already very much embedded within the constitution that gives so much power to the state to control the lives of people. Hindutva is a 100-year cultural political project. This is not new. They've been working on this project for 100 years, right? So they've been working on the grassroots level. And with the advent of 24-hour news channels, what they really did was capture the cultural space. They do this by cultural programming. They did this by really cultivating ideological foot soldiers that are stacked in every walk of life. You see a constant churning and changing of the journalistic media's landscape in which the 24-hour news channel becomes an extended arm of the state and large corporate houses. So this is really not something that just happens. I think at least a good 20 years before Modi comes to power, you really see them occupying every aspect of life, the cultural space, the political space, the legal space, and kind of revising and rewriting history, telling an Hindu majority population that they are the victims, that they do not have power, that somehow it is the others who are creating the issue, right? They really start questioning ideas of secularism. Secularism is called secular. They rewrite it as sick, S-I-C-K, secular, as in that secularism is really what is ailing India. This idea that India as a democracy is really failing and what we really need is an authoritarian leader who can just whip everybody into control. What you really saw happen in the United States is it's no different. Only in India it's happening at a much faster pace and happening for a much, much longer time.
In a sense, India is becoming more politically and ethnically polarized and more violent. And it sounds like you think that the press is having played an important role in provoking this behavior.
Absolutely. And the press does it in multiple ways. I think we should really make a distinction between the television media and the print media. And I say this because while I believe that the television media, the 24-hour news channels have completely sold out, And so have vast majority of the other presses. I think there are still a handful of journalists on the ground in India who continue to report and valiantly under great odds. But the other group of journalists, what they've really done is they've become stenographers of the state. And they do this in multiple ways. One, Narendra Modi hasn't given a press conference since he's been in power.
Wow.
It's almost impossible to hear any critical commentary on the state in any of the mainstream media or press. Every instance of impropriety, violence, lack of action, absolute and abysmal failure of governance, these things never get questioned. On the other hand, what they really do is blame everything on the opposition. It's as if you cannot criticize the government anymore. Second, it's this constant absolute megalomania where Narendra Modi becomes the front and center of all power, which means that the diversity of institutions kind of really erode. And then the press has been very much, they have been the cheerleaders of this regime without giving it any kind of critique or pushback. Second, every time the state goes after a writer, a journalist, an intellectual, a lawyer, a human rights defender, they actually use the press as the rallying call for the arrests. The press then repeats the lies of the state. For example, with the Bhima Koregaon 16 political prisoners, the press was very much responsible for creating the frenzy that there was evidence that these intellectuals and writers somehow had planned to assassinate the Prime Minister of India. In reality, 5 years later, we know that no such evidence exists, but many of those political prisoners continue to languish in prison. They regularly share false information, propaganda. Even when they're checked, they delete a tweet or they delete a video, but they really don't go back and publish retractions. And so much of the anxiety in India right now is created by the press.
You founded the Polis Project to work on these issues. Can you tell us more about it? One of the things you discovered is that in India, you think journalism is being criminalized.
Absolutely. The idea for Polis Project, I think we were all feeling very frustrated. I was feeling very frustrated about two things. The two places that I knew really well, one was academia, another was writing or journalism. They both felt inadequate and hollowed out. Academia was becoming ossified with its own languages. So much of critical knowledge was not really being transferred to the larger public. And journalism had really become explainer journalism, which wasn't really reporting about the communities that were resisting. So for me, it was very important that we build an institution that brought together in-depth research and long-form journalism as a way to keep recording what's happening, but also as a way for us to understand the relationship between power and violence in this age where both academia and journalism had somehow just deeply disappointed the communities that they're supposed to aid. Criminalization of dissent has been happening for quite some time now. And we also felt that it was very important for us to articulate what this looks like. What does criminalization look like? And one of the things that we did in Polis Project is we did a project where we tried to document, at least through numbers, what was happening to journalists in India. And this was a project that we did where between May 2019 and August 2021, we tried to document patterns of violence that was being inflicted on journalists. And we documented 256 instances of violence against journalists.
Wow.
So in all of these 256 instances, you really saw the state being the perpetrators of most of this violence. Violence included physical assaults, threats, detentions, defamation cases, arrests, in some cases sexual assaults, and charging journalists with sedition charges. And the fact that the state was the biggest perpetrator of violence in all of these instances is quite telling.
And quite scary.
Absolutely.
Very, very scary. Now let's talk about your new book, How Long Can the Moon Be Caged? Voices of Indian Political Prisoners. You co-authored the book with Francesca Recchia, and it was published by the Pluto Press in August.
Initially, this book was supposed to be an edited anthology of prison writings. And one of our researchers was working on this book, an incredibly brilliant young scholar and student leader called Afreen Fatima, her house was demolished by the Indian state without due process, and her father was arrested, all because they were Muslim and they were dissenting and they were really just bringing the community together. When the house was bulldozed, 90% of the book's material was also lost. And at that point in time, we realized that we had to respond to that political moment, which meant that this could no longer just be a collection of prison writings, but we really had to lay out what was happening. And in that process, we really started, again, as I said, we lost 90% of the book's material, which meant that we had to go back to these communities and start putting this thing together. And what this book really became was then a story of centering the communities of the political prisoners, making sure that we have a list of 250 political prisoners who've been arrested since Modi came to power. While the list is incomplete and ongoing, we felt it was important to name their names. The book has analysis. It kind of lays out how this moment came to be. So we see this mostly this book as an indictment of the current regime more than a book, but also important that because so much information is also disappearing from the web, that it was important for us to just collect and archive and put all of this together. And that's how this book came together.
What you've described is an incredible ordeal that required an enormous amount of tenacity and perseverance on your part. The title of the book, I thought was interesting. How Long Can the Moon Be Caged? It comes from a letter written from prison by Natasha Narwal. Can you tell us a little bit about Natasha's story?
I just want to say that the book exists not because of my tenacity or mine and Francesca's, but also because of so many people who were part of the book, because of the communities that were willing to talk, because without the communities, without political prisoners willing to talk to us,
right,
and speaking with so much courage and dignity, I think it would be impossible for us. So Natasha Narwal is one of the many young student activists who were picked up, arrested in 2020. Natasha, along with Devangana Kalita, belonged to a feminist organization called Pinjra Tod. They were arrested by the police for being part of the anti-CAA protests. The anti-CAA protests were protests in India that was organized by young Muslim students and others to resist what was a new citizenship law that would end up manufacturing an entire group of stateless people, most of them who would be Muslim. These protests became revolutionary. They became so important that the state literally had to use violence and COVID to shut it down. And Natasha was booked on the 26th of May 2020 by the Delhi police in what is called the FIR 59 or conspiracy case. Natasha and Devangana were one of the few people to have actually gotten the bail and released. But what you really see, again, in the book, we're very clear not to single out one of them or all of them, but really talk about an entire community of student activists who were arrested. The accusation against all of them was that they organized a protest, organized peaceful protests.
Wow, what a story. It's amazing. You wrote in The Nation about Kashmir Wala, an independent news outlet based in Kashmir. Its editor-in-chief, Fahad Shah, was charged with sedition in 2022, and he remains in prison. In August, Kashmir Wala's website and social media accounts were blocked in India, and the staff were evicted from their office. Why do you think the government saw Kashmir Wala as such a threat?
I think it's very important for us to really understand what the Indian state does in Kashmir. When I write, I'm very clear to state that Kashmir is occupied by the Indian state. What's happening in India today might seem new to many people, but what's been happening in Kashmir has a much longer, brutal history. And since the revocation of Article 370 that happened in 2019, almost any and all reportage critical of the Indian state has disappeared from local Kashmiri websites. So thousands of publications have deleted thousands of their archives. And a lot of the Kashmiri journalists really call this an erasure of memory, right? Like you're really just destroying, you're not only stopping journalists from reporting what's happening right now, you're also forcing them to delete entire archives of their reports going back decades. Now, why are they disappearing? Because the Indian state really does not want anyone to keep any records of what's happening on the ground, to a point where they now use the word terrorism to describe any kind of reporting, documenting, and writing that doesn't align with the Indian state. The Indian state has also created terms like journo terrorists, white collar terrorists. They also have a word called narrative terrorism to describe Shah. In one of their complaints, they call Shah as someone who promotes narrative terrorism. So what you're really seeing is the Indian state unilaterally declaring the very act of writing, reporting, thinking as terrorism. The other thing that they've done is also do counterinsurgency style operations on homes of journalists, which means that you literally go in, do cordon searches in journalists' homes. And this has been happening in Kashmir for a really, really long time. And for the first time, something like this happened in India when NewsClick was raided, where 800 homes of journalists was raided in India. But what happened in India now has been happening in Kashmir for a very long time. The other thing that they've done with Kashmiri journalists is put them on no-fly lists. They've had their passports taken away. Last year, India stopped Kashmiri photographer Sana Mattu from traveling to receive a Pulitzer Prize, which she shared with Reuters for covering, COVID in India. So what you're really seeing is an unprecedented attack of just going after everyone who's now trying to report. Journalists being charged with sedition. It's very hard for people to speak about this in India. Even when I am narrating to you what I reported, it seems like it's an out-of-body experience because I reported this. And yet, even as I describe what I reported, it just feels so alarming.
It sounds like from everything you've said, journalists and news outlets in India essentially have to make a difficult choice, either complicity with the government or risk arrest. In this context, you've talked about the government's use of the UAPA laws. Can you illuminate us on that a little bit?
Absolutely. One of the ways in which the state has criminalized dissent is by weaponizing laws, and we call this regimes of impunity, in which you have a series of laws like the UAPA, which is for all purposes in India's terror and sedition laws, a series of terror and sedition laws, and UAPA is one of them. UAPA is not a new law. It was first promulgated in 1967, and over the years it's been amended multiple times, and universally the law has been called draconian, unlawful, illegal, in violation of various international rules and conventions. So when Narendra Modi comes to power, he takes an already existing draconian law, and I don't know if you can make a draconian law worse, but he succeeds. So in 2019, an amendment to the UAPA laws makes it possible for the government to unilaterally designate an individual as a terrorist, which means that without evidence, you can accuse someone of being a terrorist. The burden of proof is no longer with the state to prove that someone is a terrorist. It's the person who's been accused to actually prove that they are not. The second thing that we have to understand is that soon after 9/11, when the Patriot Act was implemented, globally, countries like India also implemented their own versions of the Patriot Act. In India, it was called the POTA. And while POTA was repealed, many of the, again, draconian, illegal, unconstitutional, grotesque laws were re-legislated into the constitutions through other criminal provisions. And one of the things that was the saving grace when what was already a deplorable situation was something called the sunset clause, which meant that before every 2 years, the state would have to go to the parliament to seek permission to extend these emergency laws. They've now done away with these sunset clauses, which means that you have successfully entrenched emergency provisions into the normal functioning, which means that I think the Indian state, which already is an incredibly powerful state, now has absolute unfettered power over life and death of any person within the territories of India. Another thing with the UAPA laws is that someone can be held without trial for years. Often, bail is impossible to get. In many of the cases, people have spent up to 10, 15 years in prison under the UAPA laws without a trial. And finally, when these UAPA cases go to court, because there is no proof, there is no evidence, the case is usually dismissed. But the fact that someone spends up to a decade waiting without a charge. So the process is also the punishment. And the same thing with so many of them who have been picked up since Modi came to power. It's the PK-16, Omar Khalid, journalist Siddiq Kaplan, who spent over 800 days for simply traveling to report on a gruesome rape and murder of a Dalit girl. So you essentially have laws that can arrest you, hold you in prison indefinitely for a crime you never committed.
So that's the case of what happened to Umar Khalid, I guess.
Yes, Omar Khalid, for those learning about him for the first time, is a student activist. And Omar Khalid was arrested soon after the Delhi violence. And what is interesting in Omar's case is that he, again, like Natasha Devangana and the 19 other, was organizing protests. And actually his message was that we need to have these protests because protesting is our secular right. He was arrested for demanding peace. And I think that's exactly the irony of all of this.
Right.
Now, in Omar's case, again, there is no evidence. 2 witnesses who testified against him have already said that they testified under duress and they were forced to falsely implicate him. But what is really interesting is that just before Omar's arrest, a clip of Omar's speech was circulated heavily by all news channels. Finally, Omar Khalid's lawyers tell the court that this is not his speech. And what was presented to you is a doctored speech by the right-wing Indian politicians. The court then finally asks the television channels to produce the clip that they shared, or why did they share this clip? And almost all of the news media channels said that what they shared as proof of Omar's guilt was a doctored piece of evidence that was shared by a BJP politician who was inciting violence and hate speech during the Delhi violence. And despite this, Omar has been denied bail and he continues to languish in prison, and the trial hasn't started. And Omar is in some ways a little bit more well known because Omar Khalid was a student leader. He speaks English. There is an entire community around him rallying. But in some cases, we don't even hear about the names of the political prisoners, especially young Muslim men who are picked up and incarcerated without trial for years and years and years.
That is so sad. And no wonder they have to make this draconian choice about complicity or arrest. I know you wrote your book not only to call attention to the repression happening in India today, but also to give a platform to voices of resistance. Would you like to share a story of resistance that inspires you?
I think all of these stories are remarkable stories. But I think what has been inspiring is the few who have managed to get bail and come out. Every single one of them came out of the prison smiling. Everyone came out raising slogans to defend the Constitution, raising slogans for a better world, raising slogans in support of a revolution that would bring equality to people. And I always wondered what happens to someone who is treated so cruelly, so brutally, and everything is taken away from them. But all of them come out with this immense sense of hope for the future, despite what happened to them.
Amazing.
I think that's just truly just amazing. And they continue to do this. When we asked them, would you stop doing this? The one thing that they all said was, no. They've taken everything from us. They've done the worst for us. They've arrested us. They've imprisoned us. So we're not going to stop doing what we're doing. And they don't see this as heroic. They don't see this as resistance. They don't see this as an extraordinary act of moral courage. They simply see resistance as an act of survival. For them, what we consider as heroic or courageous is simply what a human being does to fight for dignity. And I think that just completely changes how you think about the state. And in front of this immense sense of hope, this immense sense that there is going to be change, the state, which all its might, seems so petty and so weak and so cruel. Every single one of them who have, again, it's not that there are many, it's a handful who have managed to get bail and come out. And I think that is a reminder that the state, with all its might, has still not managed to find a perfect way to take away what is fundamental to human spirit, which is to revolt, to resist, and to fight for dignity.
That's a beautiful place to end. I must say that given the grim description of India that you've shared with us, it is really heartening to hear that there's voices of resistance in spite of it. And so that's really powerful. Suchitra, I want to thank you very much for sharing your insights in what's going on in India and how terribly journalists have been treated. And to a large extent, truth has been a major victim of all of this.
Thank you so much for making space, and thanks for this conversation.
You can find How Long Can the Moon Be Caged and Suchitra's first book, Midnight's Borders, where books are sold. There are links to the two books and some of Suchitra's more recent works in the show notes. According to Amnesty International, activist Umar Khalid continues to be held under the UAPA law without trial, 5 years after his arrest. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrew Maraskin. The associate editor is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.